So have had several conversations with planners. First, I just personally, our city council at North Ogden and the planning commission themselves, this is the most engaged that I've seen any planning commission and city council during the session. So the LPC meetings, I think that they work. We promote them really heavily. And they gave regular comments on their own every 2 weeks at city council. It was pretty interesting to watch that happen. And then with the planners, this is the first time in my 15 plus years that I can think of APA having a real foot forward on taking a position on bills. They really haven't in the past. And I think that's something that the leadership team is interested in continuing in the future. And we did get a lot of really good feedback on the APA listserv when that information went out. We had people who supported the letter that was put together by the executive team. So I would watch for more of that information. Planners just want to make sure that their voices are heard and potential solutions are considered. The devil's in the details. So for the planners, what I'm hearing is that they face the practical reality of implementing these bills, yet they're often less involved in how the bill language is developed. So there's a bit of a feeling, I'd say, of like a low-level anxiety out there, or we're on the defense as the planners, as the staff planners who kind of have these bills pop up, and then we're the ones who are tasked with attempting to implement them. And then just on the housing affordability side, there's a misalignment between entitlement and implementation. So how we get this on the ground, how we do this is difficult. You know, cities can plan zone, we can entitle land uses, but we really don't have the tools to force a developer to spend money to bring a project up out of the ground. So I think there's still that state little misalignment between what do we do at a state legislative level from applying these new laws and efforts to affect moderate income housing or affordable housing, and what we do on the other end on the actual implementation. So how do we continue to collaborate with the development community? How do we make sure that there are market ready approaches that we bring forward? And I think that's really difficult to do at just this really high level state legislative level. So it was an interesting session, a lot of, anxiety and interest in what was going on leading up to it with zoning reform, and there will be more to come. So I appreciate the involvement and continue to watch for APA to be involved in this. Thanks, Meg.
Great, thank you, Scott. And now we'll jump over to, let's see here. There we go. Cameron Deal, I believe. Cam,
Yep.
Are you there? We'll
pitch
it to you.
Great. Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Scott. And thank you to the now 156 folks who have joined us this morning. Before I jump into the bills, I want to put an exclamation point on what Wolf and Scott were just saying. Because of Utah's growth trajectory, planning matters more now than ever. And we have had success at the Capitol urging legislators to recognize that cities plan for housing, we don't build housing. And it's that misalignment Scott was just referencing. In this session, we had a bunch of legislators who acknowledged that, starting with right at the top, Speaker Mike Schultz. He was very responsive to our concerns and recognized when we brought data to him to show all of the entitled units. Our data, Carson will talk about this later, but our internal data showed over 190,000 units entitled waiting for building permits around the state. That data point was very persuasive with a bunch of legislators. And I had multiple meetings with Speaker Schultz throughout the interim where he acknowledged all of the work cities were doing around the state to plan for housing and a lot of the work we've done in recent years. So I want to thank Speaker Schultz for that collaboration. And then you're going to see a bunch of legislative names through this presentation whose fingerprints were on all of these bills. Senator Harper, Senator Fillmore, Representative White, Representative Musselman. Between those 5 legislators, the speaker and those other 4, I think I talked to them more than the rest of the legislature combined during the session because we were so heavily engaged on these bills. And it all came back to this theme of partnership, not preemption. And those legislators all deserve a lot of credit for trying to find partnership rather than the state mandates that we're seeing in other states. We as league staff just got back from Washington, D.C. We were out there for the National League of Cities and we just got back yesterday. And the while we're back there, we always meet with state leagues staff from other states, including states who are facing similar battles over housing, land use, growth, and the tug of war between state government and local government. So I met with state league directors from Minnesota, Oregon, California, Florida, Colorado, Arizona, all of whom are in these exact same battles. Montana, we could go down the list. And they are all really impressed with the outcomes, not just of this session, but the last 3 or so sessions of our collaborative work compared to some of the battles that they are facing in their states. So with that being said, you can see on this slide where we started versus where we ended. And where we started, as we were leading into the session, you had a bunch of efforts around state standards for residential density, setbacks, parking. We'll reference those, more penalties on cities, bypassing city processes, and just a lot of top-down type mandates. And where we ended generally fits into this partnership, not preemption theme. Again, the recognition of collective efforts in recent years, from subdivisions to station area plans, a recognition that infrastructure is not free. The state didn't have a surplus this year. Cities don't have surpluses in any year. So how do we pay for infrastructure, and how do we unlock those housing units that are already entitled? And then how do we accomplish the shared goal of affordable home ownership? And this was really the theme of every conversation I had with Speaker Schultz. Are the tools that we're considering going to facilitate affordable home ownership or not? And then the data. Carson will talk about data later, but I cannot emphasize this enough, that the data matters. And the data sets that we were able to bring forward, whether it was on inspections or entitled units, really helped change the narrative and really got us back to what's the problem we're trying to solve with this particular bill. There were a couple of bills related to quote unquote bad actor cities that we'll talk about, but we ultimately got comfortable with those bills because we feel like the final version really got to cities that really were not trying to follow the law in good faith. And then, Scott, you mentioned the LPC participation from North Ogden, and I appreciate that. And let me just do the shout out for everybody here. Every city is entitled to participate in the Legislative Policy Committee. And this session, we averaged more than 250 between in-person and online attendance, which is awesome. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We asked 26 Slido questions, got nearly 3,000 Slido results during those LPC meetings. And we went over every last one of those, and it helped us immensely with our advocacy. So stay on top of Friday Facts and the daily email. LPC will start up again in the spring, but we really value your voice as planners and the voices of all cities of all shapes and sizes. So Melissa, you asked how many entitled units are already approved. The data point we were using was from a data set Carson collected. You'll hear from Carson later in the call, but Carson collected last fall. As of November, the number was 190,000. That was of entitled units for which building permits had not yet been pulled. Then we asked the question, why are those units not being built? And one of the key answers across the state was infrastructure. And that's what we're going to talk about now. Meg, next slide. There were several bills that really focused on providing tools and incentives around infrastructure. And these are a couple of interesting headlines. Both of them from the Desert News during the session. The regulatory reform, I sat down with Brigham Tomko. He's a new reporter for the Desert News. And I spent probably a couple of hours with him, all told, working through with him basically what cities do. And then on March 1st, you can see Governor Cox's response to the bills that we're about to talk about now, and liking them better than the original proposals from last December. These are just two of a plethora of headlines, though, both locally and around the country on housing. And as Wilf said, I don't think this is going to slow down at all. And Wilf referenced the additional lines in LUDMA. And I don't necessarily look at that as a bad thing, because most of those lines are providing guidance, not mandates. And that's why we're here, is to help people navigate LUDMA, and planning matters more now than ever as we grow. Okay, next slide. So this is a slide that we presented at LPC multiple times that then Representative White actually used in his presentations to legislators. And I know this because I joined him for several of those, including to the entire House Republican caucus, where he used this theme, and then the speaker and others picked up on the theme of partnership, not preemption. So we're going to talk about each of these bills, but they all fit into these general categories of housing product, financing tools, and process updates. Next slide, Meg. John Jansen, you're asking, do you have building permits from 2023? We will be talking, when Carson speaks in a little bit, he's going to talk about the dates that we hope to build this summer, and some that will be required by one of the bills that we'll talk about here shortly. And Cliffdown and Eagle Mountain about inviting legislators to our cities. Yes. A bunch of cities did that last year. I joined several of them, and we as league staff are always happy to join you for tours of your city. For example, there was one right before the session that West Jordan chartered a bus and took their legislators through the city to talk about infrastructure shortcomings and all the units that were entitled, 9,000 plus in West Jordan alone. And that really, I watched legislators' jaws drop when West Jordan shared with them the data about what was happening in their city. And I think it changed hearts and minds of a couple of legislators right then and there on the bus. And so we are happy to help facilitate those or join you when you do those types of tours this interim. And keep in mind, it's an election year, so legislators will be happy to come join you, and because they want to be out and about with community leaders. Okay, so you can see on the left, these are the main bills that passed that we as league staff will hit, and then the other land use bills will hit. I'm going to start with SB 208 because it really lays the foundation for some of the new bills. HTRZs are not new. HTRZs are a tool from a few years ago that is been a success story to try to maximize land use around transit, particularly front runner, but it applies to other transit spots as well. This is an optional tool, and it uses an HTRZ committee that once the city proposal meets certain criteria, the HTRZ committee then approves or declines it. And once they approve it, then it automatically captures tax increment from other property taxing entities to help pay for infrastructure. These were the main changes in SB 208. The biggest two I want to focus on are enhancing the but-for test. This was an effort to show that here's what the market would do without the HTRZ tax increment. And now we as cities need in our proposals to demonstrate why we need this tax increment to have this enhanced proposal. This but-for test is critical for any sort of tax increment, but this is going to dovetail into one of the new tools here. The other thing I want to emphasize is the HTRZ committee membership. There'll be 3 more members on that committee, 2 legislative and then 1 more from the school district. And this was part of the discussions with school district representatives around tax increment, because several of these bills focus on tax increment. And why you should care, you're going to see this box pop up in multiple slides. You should care even if you don't have transit in your city or a spot that would be eligible for HTRZs. You should care because this set the stage for the increment bills that could work in your city. And I'm anticipating a bigger conversation about the scope of tax increment this off season. Okay, SB 268, Meg. This is the new tool that builds off of SB 208. Can you go back 1 slide? This is the First Home Investment Zone, and the First Home Investment Zone Act takes these principles from the HTRZ, but then applies them away from the transit stop. Also, Chad, interested in hearing HTRZ success stories. Off the top of my head, we've got Sojo, South Jordan. We have, let's see, we have Vineyard. We have, therefore, we have, oh shoot, you'd asked me this 3 weeks ago. I would have been able to run them all off. But South Jordan, Vineyard. Who else am I missing on HT? Sandy. Yep, Sandy was the first. I know Salt Lake has been looking at HTRZ. WFRC, I know you guys have some folks on the call, so, and South Salt Lake, there we go. I knew there was another big redevelopment project. Yeah, it was South Salt Lake. And then there are 7 or 8 HTRZ proposals that are currently in the pipeline. Good, all right, so I got them. South Salt Lake was the one I was missing. So with SB 268, this is a tool that is designed for areas beyond transit stops. This is a unique tool. We are unaware of anything like it anywhere in the country, but we were trying to solve 2 problems with this bill. Problem number 1 was facilitating mixed use centers that are consistent with the Wasatch Choice vision. And problem number 2, trying to facilitate more affordable home ownership outcomes. So let's start with the first, the centerpiece. You've got your FHIZ center, and that's where the city designates the area of the mixed use center and has to meet certain criteria about what that center looks like. And the overall density for the entire FHIZ project is 30 units to the acre, but not all 30 units to the acre have to be in the center. You can count toward that 30 units to the acre units that you have in what we have called the extraterritorial areas, or as Representative Musselman frequently said, the extraterrestrial areas. My recommendation would be to keep these houses on Earth. That being said, the extraterritorial areas, you as a city would have to zone for at least 6 units to the acre, but then the builder has to meet requirements around owner occupancy and affordability. And so the idea here is you have a center and you have some housing units within the center, and the housing units have some ownership and some affordability in the center. And then you may have a neighborhood over here and a neighborhood over here and a neighborhood over here, all of which are at least 6 units to the acre that meet the affordability and the ownership requirements. And those units count towards the overall density for the project. The city puts together the plan, presents it to the HTRZ committee, that state committee I referenced earlier. And if the committee approves it, then the city captures up to 60% of tax increment, similar to the HTRZ, that they can use for infrastructure costs for this type of project. So again, this is not just tax increment for any and all housing. It is tax increment that is going to get to affordable home ownership outcomes. Meg, can you go to the next slide? So Roger, is the FHIZ requiring interlocal agreements? No, it goes to the HTRZ committee. So that's why I referenced the HTRZ process before. The city brings the proposal, and then on the HTRZ committee, all of the property taxing entities have a seat at that table. And then the committee ultimately votes to approve the use of that tax increment and approve the project. So this is straight out of Wasatch Front Regional Council's legislative wrap-up. So shout out to our partners there at WFRC. We spent a significant amount of time with them working on this bill. So thank you, Miranda, for putting this together. This is from their white paper, and we put the link here to it. And this walks you through the math of what I just described. Here's the key takeaway of why you should care. This could apply really to any city in the state. So this takes the HTRZ concept and makes it a tool that could work in most cities in the state. There is a cap that will apply in Salt Lake County to HTRZs and to the first home investment zones. There's a maximum collective number in Salt Lake County of 11 at this point. And if a city has an excessive amount of unencumbered tax increment in your existing CRA or in your existing RDA agency, then you would not be able to use these tools in Salt Lake County. But the concept here was, this is the type of tool that most cities should be able to identify an area for a medium density center, and then work with builders to try to meet those affordable home ownership requirements. Now, a builder may not ever bring a proposal that works in your city. And that's okay too. This is not a mandate. This is an option. That's why we use that term carrots, not sticks. But if you have the opportunity as a city to use it, let's try to use these tools. We recognize they won't be used overnight, but let's try to use these tools so we can tell that story back to the legislature of how the partnership over preemption is going to bear fruit. And HTRZ legislation passed 3 years ago, and we're just now starting to see that pipeline fill up. We recognize this won't happen overnight, but we think this is a really intriguing tool. I'll keep watching for comments in the chat room, but I'm going to keep going because I just looked at the time and you're barely gotten underway here. Next bill that is in the financing space is House Bill 572, the State Treasurer Investment Acts. This was referred to within our LPC meetings as the PTIF bill. I put that in air quotes because it's not quite the PTIF bill anymore, but it's still that same general concept. This authorizes the state treasurer to actually use some of the TTIF, which is the transportation investment. It authorizes some state funds, the Transit Transportation Investment Fund, as deposits to lenders for qualified projects. And you can see here the qualified project, again, has to meet certain affordability criteria and owner occupancy criteria. So this is designed to solve the problem. I don't know why I can't say problem today. Solve the problem of lack of access to financial markets for a lot of medium-sized and smaller builders. So this gets to that issue of we got 190,000 units entitled out there. Why aren't they being built? In some cases, it's infrastructure, and that's where SB 268 and the tax increment financing can help on infrastructure. And in some cases, it's access to capital, access to financing. And that's where this 572 is the PTIF bill, Carla. It's just not, it's not using the PTIF per se, it's using the TTIF that then goes into the PTIF. So if you look at the bill, the term PTIF doesn't apply, it's the TTIF. Jim, I'll come back to your question here in just a second. Okay, so it's TIF, not TTIF. Yeah, that's why, Andrew, I stumbled there for a second. I was thinking, wait a minute, I didn't think it was transit. So we'll delete that before we release the slides. We'll release the first T. Again, the key takeaway here, Meg, you go to the next slide, is, no, go back a slide, is that this is trying to provide a one-time infusion of financing to facilitate affordable homeownership units. And these are the terms that a lender would lend these state dollars to a builder, and then a builder, if they receive these dollars, would have to meet the affordability and ownership criteria. Why you should care is that you may start to see, once this money starts flowing, you may see a builder or property owner come to you as a city and say, we want to apply for these House Bill 572 dollars. In order to do so, we have to meet affordability and homeownership criteria. And so we need some flexibility in the development agreement in order to accomplish this. So you need to be prepared to have that conversation of if they're going to meet affordable homeownership requirements, what can you do as a city to help them get that across the finish line so they can access these dollars? So there's a question from Jim Spung about which entity is going to track home ownership over time. Now, we spent a lot of time this session talking through this piece. And at this point, it will be the local government's responsibility, but how you do it is up to you. So some cities have the ability and the bandwidth to track that in-house. Other cities may want to contract that out with your local housing authority or with the state. But in the development agreement, whether you're doing the first home investment zone or you're doing an agreement around House Bill 572 or the other tools we'll get to here in a second, in that agreement, you'll need to spell out how the builder and the city are working together to ensure the home ownership over time and what entity is responsible for that. So we ended up keeping it fairly broad in the statute to provide flexibility because each project in each community is going to look a little different. Okay, next one, Meg. House Bill 13. So this gets to that question of what is the problem we're trying to solve? 190,000 entitled units out there, and a significant chunk of those units are lacking infrastructure. House Bill 13 creates a type of special district to finance public infrastructure. But the key point, and something that separates this bill from previous iterations we've talked about here is property owners must have the land use approval from the local government. So the city approves the land use, and at that point, then the property owners, with consent of 100% of the property owners, will create a infrastructure financing district that district can issue bonds to pay for the infrastructure on the bond market. They are authorized to impose a property tax mill levy, but they cannot use that tax to pay off the bonds. The bonds instead are repaid through the assessment, and the bonds have to be repaid before a C of O is issued. So that's one of the protections in this version compared to previous conversations around districts, is that the debt does not pass on to future homeowners. The bonds have to be repaid before the C of O is issued. So now we have, to finance infrastructure, we have PHIZ, which is an optional tool, public infrastructure districts that a city and a developer can come to agreement on. Now you have this additional tool. So a couple people have asked, yeah, how's this different from PHIZ? The difference here is that with PHIZ, the city and the developer get to yes, and the city approves the creation of the PID. In this case, the city does not approve or disapprove the infrastructure financing district. The developer can create the district, but it is based on this very narrow criteria. And unlike a PID, the bond has to be repaid prior to the issuing of the C of O. And that protects the future property owners from having to bear that debt when they buy that land. House Bill 13, Cliff, does not affect impact fees, and it doesn't preempt other sorts of infrastructure fees. This is an additional infrastructure financing tool. It's not a replacement for existing infrastructure financing tools. Carla, there is not a requirement for housing price. That was one of the key pieces as we were going back and forth on this, is whether there should be some sort of requirement around affordability within the project. Ultimately, that is not part of House Bill 13. Any other questions about House Bill 13 here? All right, Meg, let's keep going. If they pop in, I'll address them as they come up. Okay, let's talk about another financing tool. Again, trying to address that question of what is the problem we're trying to solve around housing, and coming back to paying for infrastructure and using tax increment to do so. And that's one of the components of SB 168. SB 168 was one of the Commission on Housing Affordability bills that came through the Unified Economic Opportunity Commission. This was the third year of the Unified Economic Opportunity Commission, and the UEOC is chaired by Governor Spencer Cox. The League has a representative on that commission. It basically is the governor's cabinet, House and Senate leadership, and a representative from the League and a representative from the Association of Counties. Our voting representative on that committee is former League President Don Ramsey, the mayor of South Jordan. So the UEOC meets throughout the off season. So last year, for example, the session ended in March, and the first UEOC meeting was the first week of April. And we're expecting a similar schedule this year. The Commission on Housing Affordability last year became an official subgroup of the UEOC. Stay tuned about what that process is going to look like going forward in the 2024 interim. We're still waiting on those details. The two primary bills that came out of the CHA were SB 168 and House Bill 465. And within SB 168, there were these three major components: the regulatory process for modular building construction, the homeownership prosperity zone, which is the new tax increment tool, and the technical changes to the first-time homebuyer assistance program. Meg, next slide. Senator Lincoln Fillmore and Representative Stephen White are the two co-chairs of the commission. You also you'll notice their names on several of these bills because they've been incredibly responsive and fair and objective in how they've managed the process around housing and land use. Meg, can you go to the next slide? Nope, we lost it. Well, nevertheless, SB 168 had those three components. Jared, I'll talk about the HOPS, the homeownership prosperity zone first, and then I'll turn it over to you to modular. So the homeownership prosperity zone is another tax increment tool, but it operates a little bit differently than the HTRZ FHIZ model that I've already described. Instead, what the HOPS model is designed for is for parcels of property 10 acres or smaller. Usually that's going to be more of an infill type property. It could be greenfield as well, but it's got to be 10 acres or smaller. Let's see, Brandon, how soon it'll be posted? Yeah, it'll be posted once the recording's all done and it's ready to be uploaded. So that's for the younger people in my office to figure out when all that stuff will be ready. I just do the talking. Meg, can you go to the, okay, so actually because of the sequence of it, let me press pause on the HOPS. I'm going to turn it over to Legal Director Jared Tingey, who is our primary negotiator on modular, to talk about this portion of SB 168, and then I'll be back.
Thanks, Cam. So in this part of SB 168, there was a portion of it that addressed modular building construction. The whole goal behind this is focused around affordable homeownership and lowering the costs of construction. In that, being in a facility, constructing modulars in facilities will lower costs. There won't be extra building materials that are wasted, and that there will be faster construction. These modulars are built off-site, whether they be in-state or out-of-state. As you can see down below, why you should care. You should expect more modular factories and more units in the state of Utah. There are several different manufacturing facilities in Utah, but I know that there's a drive to get more modular facilities in Utah. To give you an idea of the process, the local building official will still perform the plan review of on-site elements only. So in other words, things that would affect on-site construction, snow loads, wind tolerance, those types of things, the foundation, etc. This would not affect at all any of the zoning regulations and zoning authority that cities have. This is just merely the on-site elements. The construction is inspected off-site by the manufacturing quality control. And then each phase of production, not each modular, but each phase of production, for example, plumbing, electrical, etc., are inspected by a Utah licensed third-party inspector with a combination license, meaning that if it's a commercial building, they'll need to have those additional license qualifications. And then it's transported to the site and assembled on site. The city still inspects the foundation, the on-site elements. Let's see. So going modular equal mobile? No, it doesn't. These are These are structures that are not attached to any sort of chassis. They are literally half of a house that are transported to and then assembled together on site. Does this cover tiny homes too? Not sure what that means. I'm seeing a no from Meg. And when you refer to modular, do you mean a type of manufactured home? I should mention this, that in the code, and we decided not to clean up to get this across the finish line, to not focus on all of the areas of the code that use different language, manufactured, pre-built, and mobile home. And this is not a HUD home. This is basically a box that can be put together and stacked, and really looks just like a regular stick-built home. In fact, I've put up before in other meetings a comparison between a modular home and a stick-built home, and it's surprisingly difficult to determine which one is which. Yep, the LDS Church built the Helena, Montana temple using this. Modular homes in any single family residential. So yes, the answer to that is yes. There is a code section that says that modular construction and modular homes can't be wherever a single family home can be in that residential zone, so can a modular. They can't be treated differently. So that's that aspect of SB 168. Is there any other questions on that? And then I'll turn the time over to Cam. Who would be responsible to inspect for potential damage during transit post-factory inspection? That's a great question. Right now, if there's visible damage to the structure and is noticed by the inspector, they can stop the process and say that it needs to be fixed before moving forward with installation or full assemblage and a certificate of occupancy issued. So those types of things are handled. Would historic district requirements supersede these? That is a good question that I'm not sure of. I believe that they would, if there is requirements that you have in a historic district that would be different for single family homes. They just can't be treated differently, modular home and construction and single family stick-built homes. Would that be a third-party inspector or the city inspector? I'm assuming you're talking about who would be responsible to inspect for potential damage. That would be the city inspector that would look for that, but it would only be available for viewing the potential damage on the outside. Whatever is visible, we wouldn't be able to deconstruct a modular facility without first notifying DFCM of before we open it up, and notify the manufacturing facility as well. So I think that is it, Cam.
Perfect. Thank you, Jared. And keep adding questions into the chat room if other things come up. So Now let me jump back to the home ownership prosperity zone, or the HOPS tool. Again, this is optional, just like the FHIZ, just like HTRZ. These are optional tools for cities. I started by referencing it's 10 acres or less. It has a similar density requirement as the FHIZ of at least 6 residential units per acre. And then you have an affordability component of 60% of the units must be at 80% of the county median sales price, and owner occupied for at least 5 years for the ownership requirement. So you'll notice this key theme through all of these optional tools. The city is expected to meet certain planning requirements. The builder is expected to build units that reach the affordability and owner occupied requirements. And if there's a meeting of the minds there, then they would qualify for the tax increment financing, whether it's through the HOPS or through the HTRZ committee, to then pay for project and system infrastructure to facilitate those units. So Bryn, you asked the question, does it have to be built at 60 the acre? No, it has to be at least zoned for that. And ultimately, I anticipate all of these tools would be facilitated through development agreements. So you may have a scenario where the city has to meet the zoning requirement because that's what's in your control. But a builder may come back and say, actually, I don't necessarily need to build in this area 16 to the acre to still meet these requirements. Great, you guys can figure that out through a development agreement. But what the city can control is the planning and zoning, and that's the minimum. Then you can see the tax increment. This is a smaller tax increment piece. The smaller piece being up to 15 years, whereas the FHIZ is a longer time frame, 25 out of the subsequent 45 years, and that's consistent with the HTRZ. So John, you asked the question about the options for guaranteeing the 5-year owner occupancy. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we spent a lot of time in this session with various stakeholders trying to figure out how much of this to codify, and we ultimately kept it general in the statute so that each community could figure out which option made the most sense for them. For example, Park City has, for the last 30 some odd years, managed a deed restriction program within the city. They have done some of in-house, and then they've partnered with, I believe they partnered with Mountain Lands to manage certain units for affordability. So you could do deed restrictions and then have the city manage those, or you could contract them out to a third party like a housing authority, or potentially even with the state of Utah, because DWS currently manages a lot of deed restrictions for LIHTC projects or other Olene Walker funded projects. Councilmember Millette, you said, is there information if this could affect small contractors' ability to compete or incentives for them to match bids? So this tool was actually designed for the smaller contractors and smaller builders in mind, because this is going to be more infill type product and smaller type projects. Likewise, HB 572, the so-called PTIF bill that's now just the TIF sub-account bill, that was also designed to try to help medium and small builders who right now are just locked out of any sort of financing, to give them a revenue stream to get projects up and going. So yeah, there was a lot of discussion about how these tools would help different builders and different cities at different points in their life cycles. Okay, let me hit the parameters, because these are important, and this gets to a comment I made now about 30 minutes ago about the overall conversation around increment. And these are the parameters of how the HOPS could be used. I mentioned that with the FHIZ, there's a FHIZ and an HTRZ component. Or with the FHIZ and the HTRZ, both have caps that apply in Salt Lake County. And there are not caps that apply in the other counties to the HTRZ and to the FHIZ. With the HOPS, there are caps that are tied to school districts. So if you are a school district, like my hometown of Murray, that is a one city school district, only 50 acres in that school district can be a HOPS. But if you are a city that belongs to a larger school district, so I saw, Ken, I'll come back to your question here in a second, but Ken Lethem, North Salt Lake, part of Davis School District. In Davis School District, you could have 100 aggregate acres. So what that means is North Salt Lake and Clearfield and Syracuse all will dovetail into this 100 aggregate acre amount. So Davis School District has 100 acres, so they have some certainty knowing that not just every acre in Davis County could turn into a HOPS. The cities would need to identify areas of 10 acres or less, have a willing builder who's willing to meet the affordability and ownership criteria. And then once you get to the 100 acres, then you're capped. So if Syracuse brings a project of 9 acres, and North Salt Lake brings a project of 10 acres, and Sunset brings a project of 5 acres, et cetera, you add that up and you eventually get to the 100. So that was designed based on dialogue with the school district, and it's a very fair point from school districts and from counties and the other taxing entities of wanting to have some parameters around how these tax increment tools are used. And that's why you should just plan on now a broader conversation this off season about tax increment, because now we have CRAs, RDAs, HTRZs, FHIZ, HOPS, as well as a couple of bills we'll talk about later around sports stadiums that all are tapping into tax increment. And so anticipate that conversation. And if you are a city that currently has a significant amount of unencumbered revenue within your RDA, both on the housing set aside and just in your overall budget, you should be aware there's going to be a lot of conversation about what to do with that. And House Bill 12 this year, which isn't on our list for this conversation, but House Bill 12 this year made some changes to those dollars. And Carson will talk in a second about some other changes to RDA funds that came from the other Commission on Housing Affordability bill. Ken, your question about property acquisition being part of the cost of the HOPS, in an earlier version of the bill, the answer was yes. In the final version of the bill, the answer is no. Okay, it's really focused on the system and project infrastructure. Because at the end of the day, we all know that because residential property doesn't, it has the 45% exception applied to it. There's just not a lot of property tax increment that comes from that property compared to property that's not primarily residential. And then with projects that are smaller than 10 acres, the amount of tax increment is going to be fairly small. And again, the focus here was let's spend that money on the infrastructure to facilitate these types of projects. The FHIZ, because it brings in that center, it brings in property that's assessed at full 100%, and therefore there's more increment available. Okay, so same thing that I've said several times now about why you should care. You may have a willing builder who's interested in using this tool and will come to the city and says, if you give me this type of zoning and work with me and with some flexibility here, then I can deliver affordability and home ownership. And what we heard loud and clear from our members over the last few months, and our board adopted this as the key principle, is more opportunities for affordable home ownership. So we didn't want more bills that would just result in more apartment complexes. Though apartments are necessary and important, but how do we create tools that result in those outcomes of affordability and home ownership? And the other key board principle was around sustainable infrastructure and tools to finance infrastructure. And you'll notice that theme throughout these bills as well. The last key theme from the board was quality of life and making sure all of these tools facilitate quality of life. And again, we feel confident that we've met all those board principles around affordability, home ownership, sustainable infrastructure, quality of life in these tools. Jake, your question about all types of ownership. The answer is yes, depending on the tool. So there are requirements, for example, in the first home investment zone, that units have to be certain percentage have to be single family detached. With the hops, you have to have at least this density. We wanted to make sure there was flexibility for all types of ownership, particularly in mixed use centers, because it doesn't make sense to have single family detached housing right in the middle of a Wasatch Choice Center. And so there is that flexibility within the FHIZ for townhomes or condos within those centers. So each tool is a little bit different. And I guess this is probably the easiest way to put it. The primary focus was single family detached, but there is the ability to use these tools for townhomes and condos as well. The condo question is still an unanswered question of how do we overcome some of the market barriers to developing condos. We spent some time talking about that this past off season. I expect that to be a primary focus of Steve Waldrop going forward. And I mentioned Steve Waldrop earlier. Let me just reemphasize for those of you who don't know Steve what his role is. Steve is a former legislator. He used to be the co-chair of the Commission on Housing Affordability. While he was in the legislature, Governor Cox hired him in December to be his senior advisor on housing innovation. And he has been a tremendous partner with local governments. He presented to our policy committee, not once, not twice, but thrice during the legislative session, primarily about House Bill 572, but he was involved in the dialogue around every bill we've talked about. And he's already starting to work on potential ideas for the 2025 session. And I know, the top of that list is the condo question and how to overcome those market barriers to developing more condominiums rather than just rental units in centers. So I applaud Steve, and he's been very fair. He's kicked us in the shins sometimes, and he's also stood up for local governments, and he's been very, very fair in his approach. So the other thing SB 168 did was make some technical changes here to the first-time homebuyer assistance program. The main thing you need to know about this is that last year the legislature dedicated $50 million to the first-time homebuyer assistance program. Only about 20 to 25% of that money has been allocated thus far. That program got underway last summer. And the city that has the most housing units that have used this project is Saratoga Springs. So congratulations to them. But there are quite a few projects in Utah County and Tooele County that have taken advantage of the first-time homebuyer assistance program. And the technical changes really came about of lessons learned as they were unveiling this program. So if you want more details about that, let us know. And then we have Willis noting that Steve will be at the ULUI conference in St. George next week. And then Steve will also be at the League's mid-year conference in St. George in April. Okay, so Brandon, can we apply carrots, not sticks approach around city's moderate income housing plans and the response on the part of the state to those plans? It's interesting you bring up MIHP because that was part of SB, or it's actually House Bill 465. So we'll need to fix that before the slideshow goes out to folks. House Bill 465, which I will turn over to Carson to explain.
Thanks, Cam. And Brandon, I'll address your question in a moment, but I want to give a little bit more context here. So there's two pieces that are really important in House Bill 465. The first is changes to the moderate income housing plan report. Don't worry, these are not, we're not changing the timeline again. We're not changing the menu items. We're simply changing we're adding two new data pieces to this. And this is because data has been so critical to the overall conversation, not just this year, but in the past couple of years. Zoning reform, as you've heard, has been really the buzz around the country. Legislators go and meet with their counterparts in other states, just like we do. And they hear from other states that, we're trying this, we're trying that. Those policies are based on their local economies, their local development environments, their local land use regulations. But oftentimes you'll hear legislators say, hey, we want to try this in Utah, how about this? And so it's important for us to be able to say yes or no, this does or doesn't fit with our current environments, or this causes other problems. The other piece that you'll hear again and again is anecdotes drive legislation at the Capitol. You might have, out of 100 rezones that are considered, maybe 99 are approved or approved modifications, but one is not approved. You will hear about that one that is not approved. Multiple legislators will bring it up. It becomes the story that drives policy. So the only way to really help fill in the whole narrative is to be able to talk about the other 99 rezones and be able to talk about the planning that local governments are actually doing on the ground. So in an effort to do this year, we worked with both Scott and Will. We worked with the City Managers Association to design a survey form to be able to collect better data around what's happening on the ground. So it's not just the one or two one-off stories that are driving policy. And that's where we came up with the 190,000 planned and entitled number, which has been really, really critical in filling in this narrative. We supplement this information with other data points that we collect from other sources. We get permit numbers from the Kempsey-Gardner Policy Institute. This year we purchased data from parcel level data from the Salt Lake County Assessor's Office, and we're looking to expand some of these other sources as well. But again, getting that information about what's happening in your cities is so critical to filling in this broader conversation and informing policy. So it's not just one size misfits all solutions. I want to talk specifically about the new requirements of the Modern Housing Plan report. First will be a requirement to, in each year's report will be a requirement to submit the number of entitled units that you have. The language written statute's pretty broad. Generally, it'll be what has a legal entitlement to be considered. So whether that's through development agreement, whether that's through what your zoning code allows now, we'll do additional training on that later on. There's not been an administrative rule on that, so there'll be a little bit more clarification there, but just be prepared. If your city has not tracked this yet, start tracking that number, start going through your planned, your zoning maps and figuring that out, start counting through the densities that you've allowed in your development agreements and figuring that out, because that will be critical this year. The other piece is that DWS wants zoning maps. So this will be, if your community has sophisticated GIS systems, this will be shape files or some other similar file, or you can just link to them if your community doesn't have those resources. So if you have a PDF of your zoning map, you would just submit that. So again, both of those should be pretty doable, but this filling out these plans is really, really, really critical. This will be, because last year there was changes to the reporting timelines. This will be the first full year that you are reporting on moderate income housing plans that have been changed since House Bill 462 2 years ago. This year is critical to tell the story of what your communities are doing. I know that there's been some hiccups with the plans. There's been some frustration with how some things have been interpreted, and we're still working through that. It will not be a seamless process, I'm sure, but we need to make sure that you're documenting what you're doing, showing your work. I don't think anybody's expecting major changes overnight, but being able to show your community's meeting with stakeholders proactively, being able to show that your community is actively considering changes is really critical to stopping the narrative that local governments aren't taking these seriously and that local governments are not actively planning for growth, because that's been a persistent narrative we've heard for modern housing plans and local planning in general. So before I move on to the other piece, I see there's a couple questions. So yeah, first on the carrots not sticks. So it is important that Utah, our modern income housing plan framework, I would argue is almost more of maybe a hard carrot approach, where you do have funds, state funds that are tied to compliance, but these are state funds, they're not local dollars. We've fought for years to make sure that your BNC funds aren't being withheld. You are not, you're not risking other serious financial consequences. But the intent is the state saying, local governments, we share these specific funds with you, and if you are not planning, then they need to go to communities who are. And so I know, again, there's been frustration, but I think it's really important to recognize that that is unique from other states where there are a lot of very serious legal and financial penalties that immediately trigger if cities don't do certain rezones or don't comply with harsher requirements. Will the strategy include HTRZ, FHIZ, and HOPS? Yes, I should clarify. So the menu items were changed in that regard. Those are not in 465. Those are in a couple different bills. But you will have the option. So if you wanted to, it's optional. If you wanted to go through and you were thinking about doing a FHIZ or a HOPS and you wanted to add those to your plan, you could do that. But just bear in mind that that would require a legislative change. So you'd have to go through the initial reporting process again. And it would just require you to restart that. So just be aware of that timing. Whereas the subsequent report to this year's report, if you don't make any changes, would be administrative. So it'd be a little more focused on the report than making policy changes. Carla, to your question, this data is just, this will apply to all MIHP cities. This isn't targeted at any communities in particular. This is just trying to get a better lay of the land. And then another part of it is, data coming from us is helpful. We can help inform and persuade legislators, but data coming from the state, I think, will be more important it'll be more of a planning, a statewide understanding tool rather than an advocacy tool. But I think it will help avoid one-sized legislation. Yeah, Jim, that's an excellent point. We worked a little bit with some of the water districts, but we've tried just to make sure we have consistent numbers focused on the city. But I know a number of communities are being required to share that data with water districts. And so if you're doing that, that would probably be the same number. Just again, make sure that that meshes up with the administrative rule definition. Tim, on your question, the 190,000 number, some cities track that differently, some do not. So the 190,000 number is pretty encompassing. We're working on trying to hone in on that a little bit, but you'll have some areas where you might have a development agreement that gives a certain amount of units, but doesn't necessarily, it gives the developer flexibility on what portion they want to be townhomes versus single family, and they might not have reached the point yet in the process where they've delineated that. So we have some pieces of that, but we don't have that whole number dialed in. We're hoping to keep working towards better information there. All right, so I'll just quickly hit on this other piece. May, could you go to the CRA slide? I'm sorry, it is there already. I was looking at a different one. Go back one. This is the danger of having multiple windows open when I'm presenting. So the other big piece I mentioned, which is the housing set aside for both your CRA or RDA, depending on how you have that set up. So there's two big changes here. I don't know how many of you will be impacted by this, but your RDA directors and your city managers should definitely know about this information. First is, I think, a major win for us, and that's more flexibility. We met with the City Managers Association last April, right before our spring conference. And one of the things we heard was some challenges that communities were having, either if you're a small community, you don't have much of a redevelopment area, but you have some small amount of housing set aside. It's kind of difficult to spend if you don't have a project that could meaningfully contribute to, but maybe your neighboring jurisdiction does. So this was an idea that was brought up there. And we worked with the RDA Association and a number of different stakeholders through the Commission on Housing Affordability to figure out a way to give that flexibility. So you may have a major regional project, and through an interlocal agreement, your set aside funds could be spent there. The other piece of it is prior to this, you could only spend these funds, or there was not a mechanism for spending these on owner occupiable inventory that might reach 120% AMI. So the rationale here was that rental housing can usually be a target lower incomes, like around 80% AMI, but it's really, really hard now without massive subsidies, to get affordable ownership stocks, and these are likely condos at that 120% price point. So again, just trying to give your communities more flexibility with these funds to make sure you're able to provide all the housing options that you need. So that's we see that as a major win. The other piece of this is a requirement for the set aside funds to be planned for, spent, or encumbered within 6 years of receiving that. And what that specifically means is if you start getting the fund incrementally, so this wouldn't even apply until you start getting the housing set aside funds. But if you get the housing set aside funds in year one, you have to at the very least have a plan where that's going to be spent by year 6. And it's just kind of a rolling effort. So many communities already do this. It might be something as simple as a plan saying, hey, we were going to spend these funds on this project, but it's going to take us 10 years to save up for it. Some communities encumber it, so they have some earmark basically. Other communities are spending it more proactively, but again, giving you flexibility to do what you need to do, but making sure that there's some accountability for these dollars. And there'll be some better reporting on this hopefully as well through the changes in HB 12. There's some other technical changes made here through to the tax credit program. The Point of Mountain Land Authority now at their discretion has a objective for providing more affordable housing, and there are some technical tweaks to how DWS administers housing grants. Scott, thanks for your point there. And then I will pass it over to onto 476.
Hi, everybody. I get to take this one. Scott, will you turn on your camera again? Scott Hess. Scott got the memo on what to wear today. He got the memo on how to groom. He missed the last part of the memo that says gain 65 pounds. Scott, you got to gain some weight. We're looking at 476 now. Prior presenters have talked about things that I think were generally kind of big policy points. We're talking more about nuts and bolts regulation now as we look at 476. This is the bill that came out of the Land Use Task Force this year. As you see the list on the screen right now, the items that have been covered or addressed in 476, at least at some level, there are a lot of items that were in front of the Land Use Task Force that did not make it into 476. I think they'll continue to be interim discussion items. The biggest one of those, I think, is probably parking and parking requirements in our ordinances across the state. That hasn't been treated in 476 to this point. I think we're going to see a lot more discussion about that. Meg, if you could advance to the next slide. The first thing that we're going to talk about here, the development agreements. Thanks, Meg. We had some language in LUDMA from the previous session that indicated that cities and towns had an obligation when they enter development agreements to advise a developer of any waivers of clearly established state law. That was an unworkable provision, and it caused a lot of difficulty. We had a couple of folks on the city and town side who dug their heels in and said they were not going to advise their cities to enter any development agreements until this provision was addressed. And we ended up with something that looks quite a bit different now. In the development agreement section, we have some language now that I would say doesn't give you the exclusive list of the reasons or the things you can include in a development agreement, but it does greenlight some things that we've wondered about. It greenlights annexation things in development agreements, and I think that's helpful for a lot of us. There are a number of communities across the state that I think have annexation agreements. They've wondered what those mean. We've specifically authorized those now in the development agreement section. So, Wilf, I'll get to your question. That's kind of the heart of what we're talking about. One of the reasons why development agreements have been a discussion is because we've heard through anecdote, we've been able to verify that some communities have required development agreements on developments that are administratively authorized without any kind of deviation from the ordinance. And I'm talking about a circumstance where you maybe have 10,000 square foot lot zoning and somebody comes in with a subdivision in that 10,000 square foot lot requirement. They meet all the requirements of the statute. Their lots are appropriate. Their street widths and construction plans meet the standards. There's nothing in terms of variation, and the cities are still requiring development agreements. And some of those development agreements had provisions that required waivers of challenges to impact fees or other things that were really outside the bounds. And so the law now clarifies that we cannot require a development agreement if the project is otherwise wholly conforming. We cannot unilaterally, as a city or town, record documents that impose development requirements on land. And so we've sort of addressed the major issue in a way that I don't think has changed our legal authority. Brandon? Yeah, that is the section. I think what you're saying, I think that is the section that was offending and what we tried to address in this provision now. The development agreement issue, I think, has been kind of a hot button one over the last 4 or 5 years on both sides of the fence. What I would tell you now is your developments that come in with some kind of a legislative standard that needs to be established, whether that's density or a variation of setbacks or a variation on your height requirements, you can still use development agreements for those. And pay close attention to the language now where it says you can't use a development agreement unless. That's you can't require it. It doesn't mean you can't use it. It means you can't require it. So I think that's an important clarification. Yes, we can still use development agreements for infrastructure reimbursements and those kind of situations. And in fact, I actually think that's green lighted in a better way now than it used to be. Meg, can you go on to the next slide? So on landscaping requirements, this has been an issue for the last 4 or 5 years. The development community has been asserting that our landscaping requirements are adding tremendous costs to them in ways that they don't think are necessarily appropriate from a policy standpoint. And the new provision in 476 indicates that cities cannot withhold a certificate of occupancy for landscaping. And I would say that that's just kind of the way it is now. We can require a seller of a new residence to inform buyers of a city's ordinance on water-wise landscaping. I know a lot of our cities have adopted water-wise landscaping requirements based on, climate change and the things we're facing. We can require a disclosure that passes on those requirements to the next buyer, but we cannot withhold C of Os for landscaping. Zach, I'm looking at your question. I'd have to get Zach Smallwood has a question on the chat about development agreements again and the ability to use those to phase commercial and residential and mixed use projects. I'd have to look more specifically at your question, Zach, because I think it touches on a couple of provisions of 476 now. Meg, will you go to the next slide? We had issues with the Property Rights Coalition folks, the development community, about the unwillingness of some cities to process land use applications for different phases of a project. It appeared to some of us on the city and town side that we were using that as a little bit of a hammer in some cases, where if we had a dispute with the developer over one thing going on in one phase and we had a completely unrelated phase, sometimes even a different project with the same developer, we were withholding permits on the unrelated project to solve the problem on the other. Ludman now clarifies that if a project is sort of a fully formed project and unrelated to another project, we can't withhold processing of the new one based on issues with the old one. Now, if you have infrastructure connections that are necessary, you can require those to be complete. The application for the new project has to be a complete application. So don't get too worked up about it, I don't think. The landscaping, does it include common areas or publicly owned areas? No, not necessarily. Read the language carefully. There's some carve outs for landscaping that has a larger and more significant, I guess I would call it, benefit or tie to the full project. So Jim, that's a good question. The next part of LUDMA, the design standard exceptions for overpressure zones. These are rare, not many communities have them. But if you have projects that are being proposed within blast zones where you could have from the blast zone damage to windows, garage doors, carports, you can employ some design standards to address that. Again, there's requirements to fit the exemption and make it apply, but we can do that. Can we limit developers to building one phase at a time? Does this limit that ability? I think it significantly limits that ability, Bryn. I think the provision is designed to, unless the phases are related by infrastructure and they tie together and then one is dependent on the other. Yeah, I don't think we can withhold that processing anymore and require one phase to be completed or not. Now, back to the question before about development agreements and can we relate phasing and development agreements? That's still something that is permitted. But again, it can't be a unilateral requirement. It's got to be agreed. On the landscaping rear setbacks in LUDMA, the new provision indicates that small walkout porches or landings on the back of homes can, I guess, encroach into rear setbacks now as a matter of state law. This is a preemption provision. We understand that. It was one we talked about for a long time and really had to discuss a lot. At the end of the day, this is what LUDMA says now. If you have landings that are no larger than 32 square feet in size, a walkout porch or landing on the back, and they are used for ingress and egress to the rear of the home, those are permitted now in your rear yard setback. So if you have ordinances that indicate that those cannot be within the rear setback, please look at changing your ordinances to get that to apply. This does not apply in historic districts. Anyway, we had discussions on this provision with fire code officials, with everyone. We tried to involve as many people as we could that could give us good information about this. At the end of the day, this wasn't a fight that we felt like we were going to win, and this is part of LUDMA now. Is that uncovered and connected and uncovered or connected? You know what, Carla? I don't know the answer to that question. That's something I'll look at. If you'll get a hold of me later today, we can talk about that one. Excuse me. My memory is that it's or. All right, Meg, the next slide. Sidewalk phasing. This is another tough issue that we spend a lot of time discussing in the land use task force. As cities, we've held on to requirements for a long time to have our sidewalks constructed in, I guess I would call them long segments, to prohibit the sort of the toothless look of the sidewalks in our projects. We have justified that with different arguments. The one that I hear most commonly is that it's a safety issue for people walking from place to place, and it tends to be primarily, we talk about kids walking to school and everything else. The problem from the development community side that was argued, and I think had some traction with a lot of legislators, was that we're increasing costs by requiring those sidewalks to go in early and then having contractors continually drive over them. And most of you see then at the end of the day, before we occupy the house, we end up doing significant repairs on sidewalks because they've been driven over so often. So LUDMA now addresses that by saying we can't require the sidewalks to be completed prior to the issuance of a building permit. If we take a sidewalk assurance bond, we can't redeem that prior to 18 months after its issuance. It does allow us to require the sidewalk to be put in and completed prior to the certificate of occupancy. So your sidewalk phasing can skip now, but it has to be installed in front of each residence before a CO. This provision only applies to single family homes and townhomes. So I think we we kind of threaded the needle on this one the best we could. I don't think this is too damaging. I know we do have that situation now where we can see, you know, some segments of sidewalks completed and some empty sections. And that's just where we are now with Ledma. Okay, Meg, the next slide. Thank you for addressing those questions on the decks, all of you. Appreciate that. The subdivision code cleanup. The changes look significant. I don't think in substance they're really very significant at all. To me, the biggest thing that came out of the change to the subdivisions part is the timing of reviews. For those communities that are less than 5,000, now you have an extended time frame for your processing. Communities 5,000 or more, it's 20 days for your review of the engineering heavy part of a subdivision submittal. For your smaller communities, that's 40 days now. The biggest takeaway for most of us, I think, is that I think it is important now that we attach the review cycle restrictions, those 4 review cycle restrictions of the subdivision ordinance from 2023. I think it's important that we attach those to the part of our subdivision process that includes the heavy engineering review. So I guess I would call it, and I'm not using technical terms, but the planning review part of subdivision submittals, where we look at the setbacks and we look at the building heights and we make sure the lot size is right, isn't the part where we have that review cycle restriction applied. Now we're going to apply that to the engineering heavy review, where we're looking at construction plans and utility connections and where the water connects and how it loops, all those things. Now that's where we're putting that review cycle restriction. I think that's the appropriate place. There are some communities in our state I know that have what I would call more of a mixed process, where your engineering isn't necessarily 80-20, but it's something closer to 60-40. What I would say to those communities is attach the review cycle restriction to the heaviest part of your engineering process. And this is just my personal preference. This isn't part of the statute, but if it were me and I were advising my city on their code drafting, I would say if you have a review process that has your planning commission involved, I would tend to not put the review cycle restrictions there, but to put it at the part where your staff is involved and put your engineering review there. That's my own preference. So I think that's all on 476. I'm looking to make sure it looks like we hit all the questions. Again, that's the regulatory part of the statute and its primary impact. And I think we're going to see more of those issues come up. So move on to 185, I think.
Yeah, Todd, I just wanted to address, there were a couple comments up a little higher. I think, Scott, if we have ordinances that already allow encroachments into rear yards, is this essentially a +1 to that?
I'm not sure what Scott means by a +1, but if your ordinance already permits the, I guess I would call it the landing or the porch to encroach into the setback, I don't think this changes what you have to do in your city, Scott.
So I guess the question would be is if the ordinance says you can have an unwalled porch encroach 10 feet into a rear yard already, is this now assumed that they can go that plus 32 square feet in addition to that encroachment that the code already allows?
I wouldn't read it that way.
Okay.
I wouldn't read it as in addition to your already 10-foot allowance. 32 feet should fit within 10 if it's normal and it's not a pier. So.
And then Todd, Samantha had a question. Does it give a measurement for how tall that porch can be? For instance, we regulate setbacks if the porch is 18 inches or taller currently.
Jared, I'm sorry, I don't remember. There was a ton of discussion about, was there a height requirement on these porches? And at the end of the day, I don't think one was included. Do you recall?
Correct. I think that on the landings, they can be above the ground. On porches, they have to be connected, but on the ground level. I think that's where we ended up.
I'm just popping up the language right now. If you want to move on, I'll look at the specific language and see if I can type the answer in the chat, but I think that's correct.
Yeah, so just as you're looking that up, I wanted to just one comment on Brandon Bell. Your comment, cities may just increase the depth of rear yard setback as a result, not suggesting, just pointing out some may take that approach. I think the whole point and purpose behind trying to address these landing and setbacks and whatnot is that many home builders have set plans that include a landing that in some cities, because of their setback requirements, are allowed. And in other cities, the exact same layout and setup are not allowed because of different setback requirements. And so in a push and the push to get affordable housing and not having to create different specs, different sizes, different layouts, that it's more of a regular building process that they can then just be able to do that. And so by increasing the setback to avoid this new law, I'm not sure that accomplishes the purpose behind why it was pushed in the first place. So I just wanted to mention that. Todd, I don't know, have you been able to pull that up as far as Samantha's question?
Yeah, there is no height requirement or height limitation, I should say.
Does it say the porch is connected or on the ground?
Yes,
Okay,
that's it though.
that's it. Okay. I think we've got everyone's.
Yep, I think that's
Okay.
it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we covered those questions up above. The next bill that we want to talk about and make you aware of is Senate Bill 185. I wanted to start off by going down to the bottom corner, why you should not care about this bill, or hopefully not care about this bill. If you're already following the law and doing inspections within 3 days, this won't affect you. However, that being said, cities are going to be required to have a third-party inspection list. For cities in the first or fourth classes, they need to have at least 3 third-party inspectors. And in the 5th, 6th, and towns, at least 1. How these lists will be used is after the 3rd day, meaning on the 4th day, a builder will be able to come to the city and say, we would like to use someone on your third-party inspection list because as required by law, the city didn't get an inspector out and inspect our project, and we want to move our project forward. So this list can include other adjacent cities and their building inspectors to be able to provide that third-party inspection. So that's let's see. So after the third-party inspection agency is able to inspect it, approve it, they send the report to the city, and the city signs off on the and issues a certificate of occupancy if it's a dwelling and a building that's going to be occupied. And then city is not held liable for any of the inspections that it does not perform. The city will still pay the third-party inspector And so it still will be the city that pays for that. But again, if those requirements already in law are followed, this won't even affect you. See if I missed any questions. Is there a deadline on when we have to have the third-party inspection list? This becomes effective, I believe, May 1. But I will look at that. Good question. It's interesting discussing all of these different bills because there's so many, like Todd said, so many iterations and so many negotiations that go back and forth. So I will respond in the chat once I'm able to look at that. Can we use, let's see, is there a deadline? Can we use one firm that has more than 3 inspectors available? I don't know that the code specifically addresses that. I think that the intent was to have 3 separate so that if one inspection agency is busy and is scheduled out, that another one can perform those. The whole goal behind this is getting faster inspections without sacrificing the quality. And so that's why there is a city third-party inspection list. Are the rates limited or do we have to pay whatever? This was a discussion that came up with stakeholders, and I think that it ended up being that the city would still like the ability and the control to manage that system and not have the builder pay for their own inspector. That's what it comes down to, is still being able to get to the quality that we're all looking for. And so it was negotiated that the cities would pay for that. And again, if that's what would happen anyways on the 4th day, according to the current law, it's just that this makes it available that they have to pick from a third party inspector on the city's list. The city has the county do all their building permits. Does this apply to that city? It does. They still would need to have a list of other third-party inspectors. And so, yes, that would still apply. What's the chance that this can get approved for CLE credit? We can get back to that. Cameron?
Yeah, Jared, I think it's highly unlikely that things get approved after the fact. But it's a good idea, Curtis, for future consideration of spring training to see if we can get different types of credit for this programming, but it's unlikely we'll be able to get it after the fact.
Mike makes a really good point. If they have to use the city's list, screen the cost before putting on your list, so that you know what the cost is going to be. I imagine that, yeah, so those would be the managing the costs that way would be a great idea. Thank you, John. SB 185 shows an effective date of May 1, 2024. Any other questions on SB 185? Could a city that has the county do inspections use the county's list of third-party inspectors? I think I think that's fine. They may want to ensure that the cost that they've assured the county paying is the same cost that they are assuring the city. for any of those inspections. If the county does the inspections, then that shouldn't be a problem. So, yes, they could put all of the same inspection agencies on the list. Going on to SB 289, Property Rights Ombudsman. This was a concern that was brought up, saying that cities are, after the property ombudsman issues an advisory opinion that's unfavorable to the city, that they are still not following that advisory opinion and still breaking the law. So the push behind this is that if the district court sides with the property rights ombudsman on the same facts, on the same issues, and sides with the property rights ombudsman, then the court can award the substantially prevailing party reasonable attorney's fees and court costs. And also, if the court finds that the city knowingly and intentionally violated the law, it can award $250 per day, which is a remnant of prior legislation. I think about 4 years ago. The $250 a day was, to our knowledge, never used by any home builders or anybody. But now adding on to that consequential damages. We fought hard, and we ended up being successful in making sure that these damage provisions, are not mandatory by the district court. The advisory opinion is not legally binding, so it is not breaking the law. To follow it, not follow that is correct. That is correct. But just know that if you continue in that, whatever conduct is if you're ruled against or the advisory opinion is unfavorable to you, just know that if it's brought to district court and the district court sides with that advisory opinion, you may end up with these damages. So just a heads up. Yes, you're right. It's only an advisory opinion. It's not binding, but just know that that is where we ended up. I still have concerns. This is Jamie. I still have concerns because adversely affected third parties can challenge the land use decision in district court if they don't agree with the city following the advisory opinion, and this bill does not address that possibility. That is correct. That is correct. This only addresses, really is interesting. It was brought up in testimony, a situation where Morgan County potentially did something with the homeowner. The homeowner suffered a loss. There's always two sides to every story. And there was in that case, but that story was not told by the legislator. And so that's just where we're at. Brandon, I echo Melissa Anderson's comments. Also, can you define knowingly and intentionally? That is pretty vague when there are interpretation issues. That is correct. I don't know how to answer that question other than the argument is there. Knowingly and intentionally, knowing that it was absolutely against the law, that there's no good faith reasoning behind why a city or a town has a legal claim to make for taking the actions that it took.
Jared, can I just jump in here? Because I think it's important for all the people who made these comments to know, like, we agree that this is weaponizing to a degree the Ombudsman's office, and ultimately legislators and felt like they felt like they made enough changes to the bill that it didn't weaponize the Ombudsman's office. So this bill was amended 3 different times through the process to try to provide a few more guardrails. The original version of the bill was basically, you have a dispute over the Ombudsman's office, you go to court, you lose, you're stuck with consequential damages. Right, Jared? I mean, that's where it started. Whereas now, the only way you get to the consequential damages is if there's really a finding that the city was acting in bad faith. So yes, I do agree that it's going to weaponize that office. And we agree that there are problems with it. Ultimately, there was very little appetite at the legislature to kill this bill. Plain and simple. They liked it. They liked the concept of it. And we were successful at really trying to narrow the focus in on bad faith actors. And we know that there are flaws with advisory opinions, and we know advisory opinions are non-binding. We made all of these arguments at the Capitol, and legislators frankly disagreed. And they wanted to have some sort of recourse for the egregious examples out there. So Carson, about an hour and a half ago, referenced how, one bad anecdote drives policy. That was very much the case here too. So just be aware that it has changed, and we made it the best that we could, but there was a lot of momentum for the original version of the bill, which would not have had any of those additional safeguards or judicial discretion in it.
All right, well, thank you all. And I know we're scheduled to stop at 11, but we're going to go until 11:15 because we do have some other land use bills to talk about, and then any other questions. So we'll just keep going. Hopefully you can stay with us. And we're going to pivot to Wilf now to talk about some of the other land use bills. And remember, you'll have other opportunities to have this training and ask questions of us.
All right. Yeah, I was just thinking we got about 5 minutes to cover the rest of these. We have a little more time now from what Meg is saying, but I still will try to cover these really pretty quickly and not get into a lot of the details unless you all have some questions about them. I suspect you'll have questions, and we may not be able to get to all of them here openly, but we can certainly respond to any questions you may raise on the chat. There were a number of other bills that were introduced during the sessions, some of which we knew were coming, a lot of them we didn't know were coming. Many of the ones we didn't know were coming did not pass. So in that regard, that was probably a good thing, and it allows for some more discussion if there really is truly an issue with some of those other issues. But the ones that did pass, and they're listed here, Meg has got them listed. Let me just go over them really quickly. Senate Bill 13 about micro schools. This bill was actually in the session last year and did not pass then, and then was brought back again this year. Primarily what it does is it establishes or identifies a couple of new types of educational facilities, home-based, essentially, micro schools and a micro homeschool, and it defines what they are, and it gives them a number of characteristics and options for people, kind of like charter schools. And as far as land use goes, all of the provisions that apply to charter schools were also applied to these new types of schools. The one thing that may be a little bit problematic for communities is the micro, the homeschool one, where those facilities can actually be located in a home and have a number of kids going there, and then enjoys the exemptions, so to speak, of land use requirements that are granted to charter schools. So something there that you need to be aware of. Cam, did you want to jump in on anything on this, or should we just keep rolling? Okay. House Bill 188, the modifications relating to the use of land, what it just basically says is that it prohibits adding to or changing a requirement of an issued building permit, except for building code compliance issues. Apparently there were some issues with that. So some places is probably another one that was driven by anecdotes. And so it prohibits the changing of a building permit once it's been issued. But then, interestingly enough, there's a whole section that was then added in a subsequent amendment to the bill regarding tower cranes and the operation of tower cranes. This was actually a substantial addition of language to the LUDMA, was about these tower cranes. That's going to be fairly limited in scope or in applicability to most of our communities, but it's there, and just something for you to be aware of. House Bill 256 on military compatible land uses. We had a bill about that in the last session or the session before, with regard to property that is located within 5,000 feet of a military base or a military land, having to essentially get approval from the State Office of Veteran and Military Affairs before the land use and a permit can be issued, and that can go forward. This bill changes that. It just requires now that for any such land use or any application for a land use, including building permits now, the local jurisdiction must take into consideration the provisions of the compatible use plans. Many military land facilities require the creation and implementation of what's called a compatible use plan for property around that military base. This bill now requires that has to be considered by the local jurisdiction before they grant or issue the permit. It also still requires that all of these applications must be submitted to the State Department of Veteran and Military Affairs for their comment. It does not give them any kind of oversight, regulatory ability. It just grants them the ability to comment on that. So some changes that took place there. House Bill 518 on the state construction code. I am not familiar with that one. So if Carson or Cam or someone there maybe want to take that one.
I can take that one, Will. So this one was talking about if there is a project that has not been inspected, not received a building permit, that if there is another independent application for a building permit, and that the inspector comes in and happens to see another structure that was not issued a building permit, was built illegally, that they can't withhold the other building permit until the other structure, illegal structure, is fixed. That independent building permit is issued, not held up by the other building.
Right. Okay. I recall.
The other aspect of that is that if there is an illegal building and it's been 10 years from the time that it was illegally built, then the building essentially becomes grandfathered in. The city can't then go back and say, you need to tear this down or you need to get a building permit, unless there's a life safety issue. If there's a life safety issue, we can still require that. That's kind of the general feel of what 518 is. Right.
Okay, very good. Thank you. The last one that's listed there is House Bill 562, the Utah Fair Park Area Investment. That, of course, probably is most notable for its relationship to the Major League Baseball Stadium, or the potential for a Major League Baseball Stadium. This is, it's sort of like, but again, it's another one of these specialized state entities that now will have some land use authority, but primarily over state land, but it kind of puts the role directly with the state rather than with the local jurisdictions, such as we have had with MIDA, with the Point of the Mountain Authority, with the Inland Port Authority, and now we have this one on the Utah Fair Park. The one bit of a difference here is this one does get a little bit more detailed in the involvement with the local government involvement in the provisions there. So in this case, Salt Lake City. And also this one now actually involves some privately owned land, which the other authorities have not done in the past, but this one does include some privately owned land that would be dictated to or would be governed by this new authority. So it's kind of it's a trend that's interesting to watch to see where we go with all of that. There were several other bills that were passed that are not listed here, but that do not directly relate to LUDMA and maybe to local land use, but that are interesting just from a broader planning standpoint, like House Bill 280 on water-related changes, which would call for the consideration of creating a water infrastructure plan for around the state, similar to what we have with the transportation infrastructure plan. House Bill 430, which is the local government transportation services, it creates a public transit innovation grant pilot program to increase public transit services in high growth areas, and would create a program that local governments could then think of kinds of transit services that they might find beneficial for the community and apply for grants for that. House Bill 502. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let me jump in here. So it's House Bill 430. It says 420. We'll fix that before we circulate the House Bill 430. Right. And this bill, I actually think it's the most exciting bill of the whole session. Let me take 20 seconds and explain why. This bill had its genesis during spring training last year. During the mid-year conference, we have our caucuses of commonality where cities of similar characteristics meet and give us ideas and potential policy topics that then the league board prioritizes. And one thing we heard from rapid growth communities, one thing we heard from large cities and really all over was, how can we get more flexibility in how do we get more transit service to increase transit ridership? So after we got that feedback from a variety of cities, we then put together, in partnership with the Wasatch Front Regional Council and the Mountain Land Association of Governments, the idea of transit innovation grants, and ran that through the Unified Economic Opportunity Commission, and it was actually prioritized as part of Governor Cox's budget. Now, it ultimately was not funded in Governor Cox's budget, but the concept made it into House Bill 430 and Representative Perucci's bill, and going forward within the existing local revenue in the UTA service area, there will be this opportunity for transit innovation grants pilot programs for cities to apply for these funds for routes that would increase transit ridership in your city. So the reason I wanted to highlight it with this group is, in a moment, Carson's going to tell you how you can submit ideas and concepts for consideration this interim and for next session. And this bill is a direct result of the feedback we heard from a bunch of cities last spring.
Great. Yeah, I think this really has some potential. It's a good program. House Bill 502, critical infrastructure and mining. There was actually another bill. There were two bills in this session, this being one of them with regard to the rights of gravel and sand mining operations and other kind of mining, but it was really primarily all about sand and gravel excavation and mining, which has been an issue for several years. And there was supposedly some discussions that were ongoing between the industry and the communities, but not really. And so then these bills came up, which caused a lot of alarm and consternation and concern. And eventually the other bill was frozen and did not proceed forward. And then this bill was modified and now calls for a study to take place during the interim around the issues of mining of sand and gravel resources. And as many of us know in our communities, that continues to be an issue, something that really does deserve the study.
And well, let me just give a shout out to league members on this one, both House Bill 502 and SB 172. It wasn't just some concern. Our folks were fired up, and our mayors and council members and U.S. staffers talked to legislators, and they heard loud and clear from city leaders of the concerns of the original versions of these bills. So thank you for speaking up, because you're right. This does warrant a significant deep dive, pun intended, on to dig deeper into the issue. There are a lot of unresolved questions dating back to House Bill 288 from 5 years ago, and the interim is the appropriate place to have those conversations. And we will be having those conversations. So if you're a city that's impacted by sand and gravel, stay tuned, because those conversations will happen in earnest later this spring. But the reason 502 got amended and the reason 172 didn't move forward was because of the pushback from league members.
Yeah, I'll just maybe throw in my tenure as Salt Lake City Planning Director. We did a lot of great things and interesting things, and a lot of the evidence you can see that's now going on within the city there. But there were two things while I was there that I really did a lot of deep dive into, and I learned more about than I ever really wanted to know. One of them was billboards. The other one was this issue, sand and gravel mining. Spent a hell of a lot of time on those two issues and learned more than I ever wanted to know about them. So they are big issues. And so it'll be interesting to see where this one goes. The Senate Bill 28 Scenic Byways Program, the original version of the bill basically proposed doing away with the scenic byway committees that are established for each of the scenic byways, and then allowing for perhaps the state legislature to consider establishing any new scenic byways. The original bill did talk about there being a membership from the outdoor advertising industry being on these on the committee, a statewide committee that would have been established. Now that was all kind of scrapped. The local committee still exists, but now they only make recommendations, and the state legislature will have to give their final approval on the designation of any new scenic byways. And the sunset date for that whole act and the provisions of that was extended, so that does not end as soon as it does. So that's a big issue to some people. We have some of the other, a few more provisions. The Inland Port Authority, there were a number of amendments that were made, changes, technical amendments and changes to the Inland Port Authority. It doesn't involve a lot of you, but for those of you who it does, it's probably something you'll need to take a look at and be aware of the changes that were made there. SB 258 is an interesting bill. It allows for the creation now of what's called a preliminary municipality. This, I think, goes to the question or the issue of an area that wants to develop that's unincorporated in a county area, and annexation may be a problem. It may make some sense for that area to be under the types of rules that municipalities can impose, but it's really difficult to incorporate into a city until you have 100, or a town until you have at least 100 residents. And so in this case, it does allow for property that in a county area that's proposed for development, and there are a number of other provisions that they have to go through and do, including doing a feasibility study, having a public hearing with the lieutenant governor, and some other things. They can then be designated as a preliminary municipality, and then go through some other process things and start to grow. And then they can, the intent is to then allow them to transition and become a town. I've had some questions from planners in some other jurisdictions around about what's the feasibility of getting an area to incorporate and become a town or a city prior to hitting the 100 resident mark, or really prior to any development getting going. And this is intended to address that. Cam, any comments on that one that you want to make? I mean, this looks like that it's a way to enhance your future membership.
Yeah, there you go. There is a cap, no more than 3 per year. It only applies in counties of the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th class.
Right.
And this will be one of several incorporation and annexation conversations this interim. Representative Dunnigan, who was the floor sponsor of 258, after he and I walked through the bill on the second to last night of the session, turned to me and said, I have a lot of questions that we need to work through at interim. And he's the chair of the political subcommittee. And then he turned to his intern and said, put this on the agenda for interim. So, just know that there are still a lot of questions around this bill that will emerge through interim. Likewise, there was a lot of work done on some annexation recodification that did not make it into 476, and that was simply a time crunch issue. The bill drafter did not get the annexation language done in time to put it into 476. So he still has it. The bill sponsors are still supportive of it. So that plus this, plus two other incorporation bills are all going to be part of a larger conversation, the interim and the annexation and incorporation spaces.
Yeah, the annexation issue has been a big one. And then, of course, House Bill 330 dealt with some annexation issues in Salt Lake County, primarily. Salt Lake County has been the seedbed of a lot of the issues and problems that we have with our annexation code over the years. It's a big mess, has been a big mess for a number of years. And a lot of the issues have come out of Salt Lake County, and that's one of the reasons why we essentially have a two-track annexation process in our state code. This bill, I think, is sort of trying to continue to solve that problem. It does indicate that in Salt Lake County that by the July 1st of 2027, that all of the unincorporated areas, islands that are left in Salt Lake County that are not part of another community council shall be annexed to the adjacent municipality, to the largest municipality, thereby pretty much eliminating unincorporated areas in Salt Lake County, at least the smaller islands and pieces that are between communities and so on. And it also then allows for, interestingly enough, the incorporation of some of that into a non-contiguous municipality. So we could, Cameron, you could wind up having a municipality that looks more like a spot of measles rather than one big piece. But anyway, it's just trying to address those issues that have existed in Salt Lake County for a lengthy period of time. And that's it from my side.
Perfect. Carson, take it away and take us to the finish line here. We're almost done, folks.
All right, I'll move through these pretty quickly because I'm now at negative 16 minutes by my clock. So one bill we want to mention quickly, the title slide before this said bills that passed that will likely change. HB 507 is the defining bill in this category. Your city engineers probably still have concerns about this. We've heard them. We worked with the bill sponsor to make it more workable, but I know there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in cleaning up the stormwater permitting process. So I won't go into too much detail, but the general intent of this bill is trying to align local and state stormwater permitting more with federal regulations because there was a wide variety. So there'll be a lot of conversations on this one through the interim. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this quite yet. May, can we go to the bills that failed? Thank you. Three high-profile bills. HB 306. This was Representative Ward's by right residential zoning bill, which granted eight units to the acre, which was a one size fits all bill. We pushed back on it, and the bill never saw committee. House Bill 367, which was the transportation utility fees bill. We were supportive of that bill. It did not pass, and I won't go into too much more detail than that right here. Senate Bill 172. This was the other gravel pit bill that was mentioned. This bill contained pretty sweeping preemptions. The bill sponsor did not move it forward after it went to a pretty rowdy caucus based on pushback from local governments. But again, gravel pits will be a big part of the interim discussion, which brings me to the interim agenda. Note this is just in the planning space. If anybody was expecting a quiet interim this year, I am sorry to disappoint. There'll be a lot going on. Everything from annexation fees, stormwater, MIHP, TIF, you name it. everything you saw this session will be coming back in some iteration through the interim to either refine what passed or if something didn't pass, try to figure out if there's a way to get to workable outcomes. So expect to see a lot come to LPC. We'll be discussing this pretty intensively, and of course, we'll be working with Wilf and Scott on all this content to make sure that your voice is included. Maybe can we go to the next slide? Go back one. Well, I just mentioned there's a lot on the docket already, but if there's some issues that you think are really critical to this specific interim or to come up next session, please do not hesitate to reach out. Or if there's another item on here that's not listed, if there's a problem that you're seeing in your community that can be addressed with state policy, let us know. If you have ideas to solve the problems we mentioned or any other problems, again, please bring them to us. I will be aggregating all of the feedback to take to the board and try to prioritize our interim time. So please feel free to reach out to me. My email is there, k.eilers@ulct.org. You can also reach out to Cameron, Justin, or any of League staff to share your ideas. But again, please do not hesitate to reach out. We want to hear from you. We want to make sure that your ideas are being included. You heard several examples of bills today that were either brought because of League members' suggestions or bills that were modified substantially based on League feedback. So it's really critical that we're hearing from you, not just during the session, but throughout the year. So with that, I think we're almost to a wrap. A couple of dates I want to point out. March 26th, we'll be having additional training for transportation bills. So if you're curious to learn more about that side of things, then we'll have that. There's a lot of administration and general government bills that passed this year. We'll do a deep dive on some of those on the 28th. And then, of course, we have our mid-year conference in April. We look forward to seeing you in sunny St. George, and we'll do some more deep dives and some more recaps on what happened this year. We'll do an MIHP training with the Department of Workforce Services on April 23rd to make sure that everybody's comfortable with moderate-income housing plans moving forward. You'll be able to bring questions if you have them. Again, make sure you're documenting stuff for your MIHP. Make sure you're collecting data in preparation of that. And then we'll have APA on May 10th in Cedar City. I'm looking forward to going down to Cedar for a little bit. We'll have regional meetings with AOGs throughout May and June. So I'll be traveling the state to try to make sure we have some FaceTime with you if you're off the Wasatch Front. Or even if you're on the Wasatch Front, we have some up here too. So we look forward to those. And then there'll be some additional interim meetings starting in May, and we'll start our LPCs around then too. So again, thanks for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in more events. Cam, is there anything you want to close with?
Great. Thank you all. This will be posted beginning of next week online and more to come. Thank you all to all our presenters and appreciate all the information. We'll sign off with that.